What's up guys? So I'm sure you've learned already. In this video we're going to be talking about the new Sony a7R Mark III mirrorless camera. So this camera comes in at $3,200 and it's got a release of late November, early December, but I believe places like B&H and Adorama and certain other camera stores are taking pre-orders now. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about the specs. Now, a lot of people initially were turned off by this camera when they found out that it shares the same full-frame sensor, which is the Exmor R, as its predecessor, the A7 Mark II. But Sony claims that they've surrounded the Exmor R sensor in this camera with new technology that's going to give you better image pipeline from the time you take the picture till the time it's captured on the card. Now, there's a lot of other things that are revamped in this camera, like the autofocus system. Sony has gone on and they have changed the autofocus system greatly. I believe it now has 426 autofocus points, which is outstanding. Now, the A7R Mark III also has one more full stop of dynamic range than the A7 Mark II. And what that's going to do is that it's going to help you with, when you're editing in post, it's going to help you bring up your shadows and lower those blown out highlights if you have them. Now this also has 4-width 4K video instead of that cropped in pixel binning 4K that you've seen maybe on the Canon 5D Mark IV, that when you hit 4K it crops you in automatically. This is true 4K, this is going to do it for you. The Mark III also takes a bigger battery. If you remember on the Mark II using one of those, I used one a couple times, you're always having to swap the batteries in and out. It's terrible. The battery life on that is terrible. They've also added Bluetooth on the new Mark III, and one thing that I'm a huge fan of is they've added a dual SD card slot. So now a dual SD card slot allows you to either back up your footage and you can record the same footage to 2 cards at once, or you can just have an extra one in there for when you need to switch over to it when your primary card is full. Exmor R sensor has an expanded ISO range from ISO 50 all the way up to 102,400 ISO, which is crazy because if you remember when the A7 Mark II came out, you could basically see in the dark with that thing. Now this is supposedly a little bit better, and those noise levels at those higher ISOs is a little bit lower. I mentioned that Sony has made it to where you don't have to crop in when shooting 4K, but you can also do that and shoot Super 35, which is selectable in the menus. And they've also gone through and they've revamped the menus. Now, that was a big turnoff for me is because I'm a Canon shooter, and when I started using the Sony a7 Mark II on a few projects, the menus were so confusing to me and I just hated the UI on that, and it really turned me off from the camera. I can only hope now that the interface is a lot easier to navigate through. Now what's really going to help you out is in post, because now Sony has the S-Log mode, and that's really going to help you with that 14 stops of dynamic range in post to take your footage whichever direction you need to take it without degrading the quality of your work. Now it may not be a big deal to you when you have a camera that shoots 4K, but the Sony also shoots 1080 and it can shoot that at 120 frames per second if you need some of that slow-mo. But in 4K you can only either shoot 24p or 30p, but that's most cameras in this range, so that's not a big deal whatsoever. Now the camera footprint is almost nearly exactly the same, which is astounding with the new features they've packed in there, especially the bigger battery and the dual SD card slot. Now, one thing I do like about the A7 series is that they are small cameras. With that said, I'm a big fan of having battery grips on my cameras, but when you have all these stabilizers, having a small camera is often better, because the lighter the camera, normally cheaper the stabilizer is. I will also mention that the Mark III has a 5-axis stabilization system put in the camera, so that's really going to help people that are shooting handheld stills, especially when they're rapid firing with that 10 frames per second, and it's also going to help people that are shooting video because it's going to allow you to put it in your hand. You're not going to always have to have a Joby GorillaPod, or you're not always going to have it on some sort of stabilizer itself. Now one bad thing is that there's no flip out screen still, but when you get up into these prosumer cameras, for some reason they never put flip out screens on their cameras. And that's kind of almost a kick in the face to the content creators that are buying these things that are YouTubers and vloggers and stuff, because they oftentimes have to buy a monitor, which is the correct way to do it. If you're, you know, shooting something on set, you wanted something that's a little bit better than what's built into your camera. But when you're just a run and gun operation, sometimes it's nice to have that that LCD that flips out so you can check everything you need to check. Now me myself, I'm a Canon user. I'm currently shooting on an 80D, and I've been spoiled with Canon's dual pixel autofocus system, which is hands down the best autofocus system on the market. So I'm curious to see how this new Sony Mark III's autofocus system stacks up, because at the time of buying the 80D, I knew I was going to do some sort of vlogging, some sort of content creating, and I had just bought a Ronin M, so I wanted something that I could throw on the Ronin without having to pull focus, without having to do any of that, just set it and then just go. Fortunately for me, the Canon 80D has a lot of downfalls, whether it's low light performance, it is a 24 megapixel when I'm wanting to blow up huge prints of something, that kind of limits me there. The biggest thing is that it still shoots 1080, so I'm having to shoot everything in 1080 unless I go rent equipment, and you know, that gets to be pretty pricey. So I'm looking for something that shoots 4K in the near future. So this could definitely be a contender. I was originally wanting to get my hands on the GH5, but this right here is looking like a better option, especially if they have revamped their menus and their user interface. Three major things that are selling me on this camera are: 1, the dual SD card slots, 2, the autofocus system, and 3, the uncropped 4K. I would definitely say come late November, early December, when these get into some of the early adopters' hands, some of the average everyday users, that's when it will really be the best time to make a good decision whether or not you should buy this camera. Now the issue with that is there's already video out from Sony shot on the A7 Mark III, and then there's a few of these you know, sponsored Sony shooters and whatnot that have these in their hands. But a lot of times these are shot under perfect conditions. We need to see somebody that's just your average guy that's got one that's going to upload a video to YouTube or go out and shoot some street photography with it to make the decision. Or at least that's how I base my opinions. So instead of pre-ordering, if I was you, I would wait maybe till January or February, let some of these people have them in their hands. That way you don't get stuck with that buyer's remorse, because $3,200 to come out of pocket on one camera is a lot of money, especially with all the other options out there. And that about wraps up the Sony A7 Mark III. If we get any more details, maybe I'll make an update video. If for some reason I get my hands on one, I will definitely make a new video about it. So guys, don't forget to subscribe and comment, and remember, just go shoot.